these conversations on Zoom. We have another nicely varied session for you today. We have Ayal Adler talking with Malcolm Miller. I'm just going to introduce them both briefly and then pass over to the two of them for our conversation. Ayal is a composer, he's a pianist, a senior lecturer in composition and theory at the Jerusalem Academy of Music and Dance. Just to give you an idea of the kind of company he keeps, his symphonic work Resonating Sounds was premiered by Daniel Barenboim and the West East Divan Orchestra at the Proms here in London. Crystallization was re-premiered by Zubin Mehta and the Israeli Phil, and Alone I Return from the Night was premiered by the Munich Phil with soprano Hila Baggio. His conversation partner today, Malcolm Miller, is a musicologist and pianist. Malcolm's honorary associate and associate lecturer at the Open University in the UK, and he also teaches at the City Literary Institute and Morley College, both great London educational establishments. He's published widely on 19th to 21st century music, including on Beethoven, Wagner, and Jewish and Israeli music. Malcolm and Ayal, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Phil. I'm going to kick off, I think. Is that right, Ayal? And I just want to express both of our thanks, actually, to everybody, all the organizers.
Thank you very much.
Won't name them, everybody, but at the end, but particularly Geraldine, who's been a stalwart since the beginning, and Phil, who's been running things this year, and of course our hosts at UCLA. Now, it's a great pleasure for me to actually do this conversation with Ayal, because I first came across Ayal in 2006 when I was reviewing a concert at the Guildhall School of Music, contemporary music concert, as I would do for the journal Tempo. And at that time I wrote, Adler is one of the promising voices in the younger generation of Israeli composers who received a doctorate in Canada and whose works have been performed at the ISCM and recorded. The concert, in fact, was a mixed bag of Israeli works performed by an outstanding ensemble called Meir, who since then have gone on to great things. And the piece that was performed was a work called Reminiscence for violin and piano. And we're going to talk about that work in a little while. Amongst the other works were another UK premiere by Gilad Hochman, and some works by Betty Olivero and Reuven Sarusi, the more sort of well-known, let's say, names of that time. And it was the sort of introductory type of program that is, I would say, necessary for composers such as Ayal, whose works are not, chamber works particularly, are not often heard, let's say, in UK concert halls all that often, and Meir were just the right group to perform them. Nearly 10 years later, I was again to see Ayal on the stage of the Royal Albert Hall. We just heard Phil mention. The piece was Resonating Sounds, a large-scale orchestral work written for the West East Divan Orchestra with Barenboim conducting. And the unique thing there was that this was the first time that the orchestra had commissioned a work to be performed by an Israeli composer and an Arabic composer, but this time it was a Syrian-American, Karim Rustum, and it was a really interesting evening, very different, diverse styles, and typical for a very sensational performance. It was part of a world tour. And Ayal was there with Karim taking the stage. Since then, actually, Ayal has also had further dealings with the UK scene and has won an award for one of his recent works for electric guitar, a British recording company award. So, and I think he has maybe other plans to do with the UK. So hoping from my perspective that all comes about. But we're now also talking on an international level. And what I would like to start with, actually, rather than going through Ayal's whole biography, which we will come to and discuss your education, I actually wanted to start with a really recent piece. And it's actually something that Phil mentioned, is a song cycle entitled Alone I Return from the Night, 3 songs and interludes for soprano and symphony orchestra to poems by David Vogel. And this work was given its world premiere on the 24th of November 2019. If you can cast your mind back to that date, sort of only days or minutes or hours before lockdowns sort of all over the place. And the conductor was Omer Wellber, another outstanding Israeli artist, conductor, and who is currently actually chief conductor of the BBC Phil. And the orchestra was the Munich Philharmonic, who'd actually commissioned the work. Now, I have to explain it. They didn't commission the entire work because the work had a history. In fact, the 3 songs of 2019, which were premiered at that time, had earlier incarnations. The very first incarnation was a work written in 2006 for the Meir Ensemble, again, a chamber work for mezzo soprano, entitled At the Gate of Darkness. And I just actually want to share screen here at the moment. Excuse me. In this early song, the poem which you're seeing now, Black Flags, was the second of the two songs. It was a 2-song cycle. This was performed by the Meir Ensemble in 2006 and actually played in a film all about the UMZE conference, and it was filmed in the very chamber where the UMZE conference took place. We'll come back to that in a second. A few years later, Ayal Adler orchestrated them for chamber orchestra, and in 2012 this was added to 2 more songs by Vogel, and the title now became Solitary I Return from the Night. And this was recorded and filmed by the Israel Camerata in 2017. 2 years later, the Munich version took place. The Munich Orchestra again commissioned another version, an expansion for orchestra. So actually I wanted to discuss this, what I would call revisitings of the same piece with Ayal. And at first, before we do that, I think we're just going to listen to a clip. But before we do that, I'd like everyone just to look at the words. Obviously, the Hebrew on the right, probably, Ayal, you'd probably be able to read it better than I could. Would you like to just read this poem? Because we'll be dealing with
the Hebrew or the English?
Maybe the Hebrew would be rather good.
Hebrew. All right. So it's the third song from the cycle of Vogel that I chose. דגלים שחורים מפרפרים ברוח כחנפי ציפורים אסורות. דרך ימים ולילות כולנו שכוחים נלך ובחשאי עד הגענו אל השער האפל הגדול. כילדים נבערים שם נעמוד בחרדה ונצפה לפני פתח השער האפל הגדול.
Thank you so much. And we're going to come back to the last line, which you read, until the great dark gate opens. But at the moment, we're doing black flags flapping in the wind like the wings of caged birds. And we're going to hear the performance of the UMZE film and the if while I'm doing it, if maybe Ayal could just introduce the singers, the performers.
So the original version in 2006 was actually one of the first Meir pieces written. I was composing residence and we worked on it together. Singer was a mezzo-soprano, wonderful singer, Ayal Amit. And then the later version with Hila Baggio and Omer Meir Wellber is a soprano. So basically the whole thing shifted upward.
Okay, so we're going to hear the first opening, and I think you could be able to appreciate the way that Ayal's setting these beautiful evocative words, and then we'll discuss.
גלים שחורים מפרפרים
So I just wanted to introduce the opening of the piece. So Ayal, before we talk about that last line, and we're going to hear how you set that, the poetry of David Vogel, what attracted you initially to this poet? And I don't know if actually we're very aware of David Vogel's poetry. Maybe you could just introduce who he was,
Oh.
Thanks.
Well, it's hard to mention Vogel in a short paragraph. I personally think he's maybe one of the greatest Hebrew poets of modern time. And maybe he didn't earn the place he deserved because he only been in Israel for just 1 year, 1929, 1930, didn't adjust to the climate, and he returned to Europe. He was basically wandering in Europe his whole life, was born in Ukraine in 1891, and tragically murdered in Auschwitz at the very, very, very end of the Second World War. He was captured in Paris while hiding in a Jewish family. And before that, he hid his writings in a box in the garden of the Jewish family he was hiding, and then was later really, it's like really, I think should be maybe do an opera at some point. Was later discovered, this box, and was sent to Israel to a translator named Asher Barash, and also after years it was discovered. And in the 60s, where poets like Natan Zach and Dan Pagis and rediscovered him, and he became more well-known. They actually, even Natan Zach said he's bigger than Bialik. He's like lately discovered slowly. And it was very interesting that maybe a few years ago, they found another hidden novel of a Viennese novel he wrote on a very, very small piece of paper and was basically published lately. So it's really astonishing figure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, he writes in a very, very evocative way, and I'm just wondering about the imagery that he's using, particularly in this last song. But actually, while I'm doing it technically, Ayal, just when you're holding the microphone, just a little bit further away, because we're getting there's a little bit of noise. Okay, I'd like just to look at actually the last line and what you were how, because we're going to hear it, how you brought this imagery of the gates. If we just remind ourselves, like ignorant children, we will stand there anxiously waiting until the great dark gate opens, is the translation I have. And you had a certain imagery, ideas that sort of came to you about this.
So now it's okay, Malkulam, when I speak?
Yes.
So basically, I mean, for me, because my music is, I would say, it's hard to describe one's music, but maybe abstract in general. So it's more atmospheric and around textures and colors, timbres. So for me, it's not that common to write for text. And when I actually searched for text back in 2006, I discovered Vogel. For me, it was very contemporary, as if his poetry was written yesterday. And it's really interesting that he wrote in a Hebrew. He basically invented a modern Hebrew where people still spoke Yiddish in Europe. So
he was a Yiddish speaker himself.
Yeah,
he started off as a Yiddish speaker
and
taught himself taught himself Hebrew.
Definitely taught himself. Yeah, he was like a yeshiva student in Vilnius.
I mean, do you connect his, obviously, from the period, do you connect his writing to the Holocaust? Do you see his imagery being, is that making it too specific, or should one not do that? I'm just sort of just throwing it out because.
Yeah, it's interesting because he was after that, after like a religious background, he basically left religion. He was an atheist, but for me, he still was very deeply rooted in the Hebrew language, and he was trying to fit in the Hebrew Guild in Israel, and they basically invited him. So his whole life is struggling between a feeling of very isolated. He was even isolated from the European mainstream at the time, and he was living in Europe, writing in Hebrew, and where he was in Israel, he didn't feel belong. He couldn't hold a study job. For me, it's like a tragic journey of a Jewish artist, like wandering and searching for identity until the very tragic way it ends. And for me, the poems is, in one hand, is very philosophical. It's not typical to other Hebrew poets that you can feel, you know, the time and the history of it. But on the other hand, for a song like that, for me, when I read it, I actually felt the story of the Israelites walking in the desert, like walking this group of people and searching and going towards this, you know, this destiny, this great gate of darkness, and waiting for it to open in vain. And also, Malcolm, when we spoke, I also mentioned the Ne'ilah prayer that closes the Yom Kippur cycle of prayers, because פתח לנו שער בעת נעילת שער כי פנה יום, so open the gate for us as the day turned. And for me, it really resonates, I don't know, consciously or subconsciously when you wrote it, is something that is deeply rooted in a Jewish belief and in a Jewish elements. And so I felt very keen to end the cycle in this song.
Right, so there is a sort of resonance. And how musically do you get this feeling of the sort of Ne'ilah prayer, as you say, the concluding prayer of the Day of Atonement, which, how do you, is it musically referenced somewhere? Is it something we have to listen there for? Is it something, or is it just your intention? I mean, how, can you just talk, we're going to hear that extract actually.
Yeah, I think the cycle and the song itself, I would say, quite complex in terms of many transitions in scales and like heavy textures, even in the chamber original version. But then at the end, it becomes simplified and very crystal clear, I would say. And in the original Meitar version, the clarinetist, he plays in one hand in the clarinet, and the other hand he played this bell-like, you know, glockenspiel.
Yeah.
And so it's like an image for me of the gate, you know, the bells ringing at the footsteps of the gate, and the bells and the resonance overtone is a motive that after this piece, it goes through maybe all my pieces, the idea of resonance and bell-like sounds. And even in the Munich version, we had a large battery of percussion. So basically I try to make this imagery even larger.
Right. Well, let's listen to the Meir version where the clarinet actually puts his clarinet down. Well, doesn't. Sorry, he puts it into one hand and starts the using the percussion. So this is for the last line, and then we'll hear it in the expanded version. So here is the last line, as it were, singing from Lifnei Hayvtach Hasha Haofel Hagadol. Here we go. No, sorry. I'm just...
יאללה. אני הולך לאכול אותי, סלח לי שאני בורח. ביי. תודה.
Well, that was one version of the ending of that song, and I'm now going to just quickly skip to the same place, but this
Maybe I'll
version.
just say one word. That,
Yeah,
the
please.
conductor is Giselle Bendor. We actually, I see, it's really nice to see some Israeli musician friends, including a solist of another piece that we discussed, the Mandelin Concerto, again with Omer, Meir, Wellber, and the Israeli Symphonette, Yaki Reuven, Jacob Reuven, the mandolinist is here. And one word about the clip. It's part of a movie, a documentary called the UMZE Recording, was made in 2009 by a producer named Emre Somes, and they took Meitar as a very young group then to the UMZE, to the actual same room where the Notorious, the final solution takes place, and they did like a whole day of very powerful recordings of both Israelis and also composers like Gideon Klein, who was deceased in the Holocaust, and they did like interviews with the composers, and they chose this piece as part of the movie. And this movie is still being filmed in documentaries, in the Cinematheque, here and there, and it was quite powerful for this ensemble to play this music inside this room.
Indeed. And now this, the version that you made, what's fascinating is how you've expanded the orchestration, and obviously the music to a certain extent is the same music we're hearing, but with a very different effect. And one of the things is that you've changed the mezzo for sopranos. I wondered about that, but let's listen to this with the Jerusalem Camerata. The same line.
I'm not hearing anything. Is anybody else hearing anything?
Oh, you can't hear it. You're not hearing anything.
Clear on my end.
Clear on your end?
I heard it.
Sorry, nothing.
Clear on my end.
Okay.
All right. I don't know why I'm not hearing, but okay. I'll leave it to you fellas.
We carry on. So that was the chamber orchestra version, Ayal, and then you took this work and you added even more instruments and also added some extra really big chunks of orchestral music as interludes, and that was the Munich version. So obviously the idea of sort of building on what you've done and sort of organically somehow developing the material is something which you're interested in. I mean, in the sense, it puts you in the same, there's a good historical tradition for that. I mean, it goes all the way back to well, even before, but certainly Handel used to use his own music again. Pierre Boulez famously sort of commentaries on his works. I just wondered, what do you feel? I mean, what happens to a piece? Is there a definitive piece? Is the last version, the Munich version, the definitive one, or do you say, are they all different? Are they all sort of independent? Have you got a comment to say? Just a
I
word
think
about
after
that.
doing this chamber and small orchestra and large orchestra, I think maybe to do an opera for this, and that's it. But
Right.
maybe to add a fourth song, or I really like the idea of the interludes, because the texts are so intense in all three poems, and I felt that in the Munich was really perfect.
Yeah, I love that listening. I mean, I can't. It's on your website for anyone who wants to actually hear it, and it really sort of adds to the mood building and the whole drama and full of color and orchestration. But there's one thing I did want to actually bring up. I mean, I don't want to sort of pigeonhole things too much, but obviously there is a connection with the Wannsee conference, using a poet, the poetry which comes from this sort of period. I mean, I wouldn't call it a piece about the Holocaust or something, but there's some connection there, isn't there? And there's some connection to Jewish tradition, which you've mentioned. So I just wanted to actually bring up at this point, do you think this is something which has to do with you being an Israeli composer or a Jewish composer, or is it just that you're impelled by the quality of the music? And how do you relate to other composers from Israel who've treated this topic? I mean, I'm thinking perhaps of completely different works that touch on it, like Noam Sharif's Mechayim Eitim. I know I've received lots of comment. It's a collage type of piece, isn't it? And obviously there are lots of other composers. We have also non-Israelis like Steve Reich, who've written works that somehow touch on the Holocaust. I mean, do you see yourself there, or is it not a conscious thing? Was it just that you were doing it?
I guess it's not conscious, and this topic is so huge. And for me, when I went to approach it, I think it's kind of risky to. So for me, it was actually interesting to take a figure like Vogel, which is totally vague, and the destiny, what happened, and he's running away from Judaism in a way, and then what. And for me, it's more elusive kind of way to kind of approach this topic. And with the Wannsee, I think we all felt that this piece felt that it's belonged to this kind of journey of this mitar and all this the movie we're trying to create. And I think the Munich went a bit further from that and becoming more almost like a semi-operatic setting, and on a very large scale. But the theme is still totally there.
Yeah, it's amazing how you would get from song cycle to an opera, but that's probably another too big a topic. What I'd like to do is now is look at another piece which actually evolved. Okay, another piece of yours. And that is a piano piece from your, this is going back a little bit. So I just wanted to talk about your Misterioso, you've called it, which is a sort of musical marking, meaning mysteriously. And it's a piece for piano. Now you wrote this I just actually at this point share the screen. which is your career in a page. Hope you don't mind me, did it as sort of a timeline.
Oh my God.
And so what I want to sort of just point out, sort of, it's a wonderful achievement that you started with your education at the Reuven Academy and then the Jerusalem Academy of Music and Dance. And this the person that you studied with at that time was a very well-known composer, Mark Kopitman, who'd come in the 70s from the Soviet Union, then was. And then after that, you went to Canada, to McGill, to do a PhD. And this is where you started writing this piece, but what you told me was that you wrote it actually for Kopitman's, originally for his 70th birthday as a homage. So and then eventually you expanded it, and it became a sort of more than twice as long. And so what I wanted to ask you, first of all, was actually about your studies with Kopitman. I'll stop sharing there. This is something you can say about how he inspired you. What sort of a teacher was he? What is it that you perhaps got from him, if anything? And did he exert an influence on your style? And is anything in this piece, perhaps, that relates to that? And
right. Well, Mark Kopitman, it's a huge father figure, actually, for maybe all of us, because I think he raised 4 generations of Israeli composers. Some of his students now, actually, they're like almost retiring, and I was like almost 3rd or 4th generation. And he was born in 1929. And did a degree in medicine. He was practicing medicine for a while, and then he said, I don't want to do that. And then he went to music, and he was quite well-known composer in the Soviet Union. He wrote like an opera and chamber and orchestra. He even wrote a book about choir techniques. And then he left to Israel, and then they basically, they erased him from the books because like a traitor, you know. And then after over a decade, he returned like a hero with his music, and they accepted him in open arms. And I was lucky to be with him for 6 years. I was assistant for him for 2 years. And when I arrived to McGill, to Canada in 1997, he just turned 17, and they did special concert with former students. And I was asked to write something, and I tried to take some of Kopitman's ideas about folk music, which he was very interested in, especially Oriental fragments and tunes. Like a famous piece I recommend to listen to it is a piece called Memory. He won the Koussevitzky Award in '86. It's like based on a Yemenite traditional singing, with the Yemenite singer, Hila Baggio, who sings at the beginning and the end. She walks off the stage, quite dramatic, and then she returns at the very end of the piece. And the music is like a reminiscence and memories and recollections of small fragments from the piece, but the orchestration is quite, I would say, post-Shostakovich and some Bartok. So you have this Eastern European tradition combined with all this folk and exotic music that he heard in the synagogues and the Yemenite tradition. So it's a fascinating piece, which really combines, I would say, East and West and Jewish and non-Jewish. And so when I wrote Misterioso, I took for me what I found to be like Armenian-like scales, like something very exotic. And similar to Memories of Kopitman, the piece goes to like small recollections and working with these motifs until the very end. You have this dodecaphonic line, again a melody, which basically goes to a different direction. And also I would mention, if you mentioned Kopitman, a very famous cycle of his music is called cantus. He has cantus 1, cantus 2, cantus 3 for different instruments. So because he said that for him, after all the music development, the melody is the most important factor of the music. So Misterioso starts and ends with a tune, with a melody.
Okay, so actually, let's just listen to it, a little snippet of it anyway. I'm just going to think where I've actually got it. I think it's on the PowerPoint. Sorry, no, it isn't. Let me just do that again. Sorry. Yes. So actually, I'm starting. Well, we didn't just talk about that, but when you expanded it, you explained to me that the first sort of 4 minutes was actually the original piece, and then you sort of got longer and longer. And this is Amit Dolberg of the Meir Ensemble who's playing it, and this is actually from the middle section. But I wanted to ask you about this, perhaps afterwards, is your use of the piano, because I find it incredibly, first of all, fascinating and full of color. I mean, everyone comments on your wonderful orchestration and your use of texture and color in general, and the sort of delicacy. And I think you've done it here. You've brought out of the piano completely new ways of finding sonorities, and particularly the low and the high registers. The use of register is particularly fascinating here. So this middle section sort of leads to a sort of a climax and then introduces what you said, the melody. And every now and again you hear the harmony, I think you said, is derived from these Armenian scales or the modes. So everything is here. So here we go, a short extract. But it's just a taster. Yeah, I mean, it's a little sort of tip of the iceberg of all the different things that you're doing with the piano. You said something about the last melody being dodecaphonic. Can you explain that? I mean, it doesn't. It certainly looks dodecaphonic, and but it sounds actually very melodious, if I put it that way. And then you get this very wonderful sort of rich resonance of those clusters, which presumably are the modal complexes. Do you want to just say a little bit about your musical language there?
Yeah, well, it's actually 12th tone, but in a very tonalistic implication with you have almost chords of minor chords, but you have all 12 tones. And something maybe about the piano you mentioned, because I'm originally a pianist. I graduated from the conservatory as a teenager, and I still play. And for me, it's a blessing and a curse, because I can't just get away from the piano. And when I write something for orchestra, the piano is just becoming a soloistic. And so I'm very attached to these chords and to this I would say post-Debussy, post-Messiaen French influences of colors and timbres, and using of very high bell-like register and something very low, both. And so just, I would say that later pieces, like especially, I would say the Mandolin Concerto with Yaki and Omer, and after I transcribed it to a violin concerto, it was fascinating to get away completely with the piano and look for melodies and for using of non-harmonic instruments, and to discover complexity there was actually very important as for my development.
Okay, we come to the mandolin. Actually, you mentioned the French influence and also this idea of bells and resonances, and that makes me think of the spectralists and sort of spectralism, if you want. And I just wondered also, I hadn't really asked you about your studies in McGill. I mean, I have no idea. I mean, who did you study with, and what was this? Was this a crucial? Was this an important time for you? Was it sort of did it open up some new avenues of technique? And was this particularly could that have been the time when you sort of got into spectralism or anything like that? I'm just sort of feeling my way here, but
yeah,
what happened? What happened there?
I chose McGill. It was actually fate to what I was accepted to different schools, but McGill seems to be very practical and gives a lot of opportunities for performances, and it was fantastic. It's like is a French culture atmosphere in North America. And my teacher is Jewish composer Brian Cherny, wonderful Canadian composer, also influenced by, I would say, post-Messiaen and post-Debussy, and also with atonality. So it was a perfect match. And I discovered, I didn't know this composer before, but I discovered the spectral school, like composers like Tristan Murail, Gérard Grisey, Kaya Saraya, Magnus Lindberg. I was immediately drawn to this idea of harmony as timbre and using the overtones. And I actually teach a course in the Jerusalem Academy for 10 years now for the master students. The spectral school, very practical seminar that they write short pieces according to this tradition. And so I'm still in touch with these ideas.
All right. Well, that's really interesting. Thank you very much. I mean, so have you the other side of it is the 12-tone, the Viennese influence, as it were, the Viennese school, so second Viennese school, and that's and the Germanic. There is a piece, of course, which relates to that, and that is your Reminiscence, which was what I mentioned. That was the piece that I first heard in 2005, and in that work, it's for violin and piano. You actually quote the Violin Concerto by Alban Berg, and the harmony is very. It has a sort of a Viennese. I mean, I'm talking about the second Viennese school type of feel to it and richness. Was that a one-off, or is that part of your makeup? Do you feel still?
It's really interesting because I think that hard to describe my style, but maybe there's a mixture of French and German in a way that, these colors and post Debussy and post Messiaen, and now the spectralist, and the opposite, the German, the intensity, the dramatic and emotional, I would say even post-romantic sometimes. I think that in the unique version of the song cycle, where Omer and Hila did, there's this dramatic outburst of this, I would say, post-Schönbergian kind of orchestration.
Expressionistic.
Totally. And I think the Reminiscence is a bit unique work in my over, because it's really based on Berg concerto in a source cycle of ideas of allusions and reminiscence until the only time I really quote music from the literature. It's like I quote 2 places in the concerto, and then I quote the Bach chorale that Berg brings at the very end of the concerto. So it's like a cycle of allusions inside the allusions within the atonality language of the work.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to listen to it. I think because of time, I think we will keep that. Perhaps when we have open it up for questions, and then if somebody would like to hear that example,
Sure.
we've got a little bit of the thing. And I think what would be nice if we can just talk about another very recent piece of yours. Again, it's gone through various versions. It's the piece called Hidden Light, which was performed in 2020, but I think it dates back already to 2008, was it originally? Well, no, they're different they're different levels of dating back. So it started off, I think you told me, as a McGill piece, a piece written at the end of your doctorate at McGill in Canada as a crystallization. And then it evolved through different guises into Hidden Light. And maybe you can just talk a little bit about it before we listen to the piece. Is that
sure?
Okay?
Is a good case of revisiting, because
right.
it's my actual doctoral thesis called Crystallization. It was really nice that we could write an essay, elaborate essay about a symphonic piece that we composed there. I was composing residence for McGill Symphony, but I left to Israel, and then he won the Akum Award, and it was actually premiered years later in 2010 with Ilan Volkov and the Israel Symphony, and 2 years later I did a new version for Zubin Mehta and the Israeli Phil. And in 2008 I took the same ideas, but I changed the orders of the sections, and so everything is totally getting a new meaning, because for chamber arrangement, because the crystallization was the idea that it starts with chaos, start and end with chaos, searching for focal point. Then you have this horn melody in the midpoint of the piece, a symmetrical atonal horn melody with heterophonic kind of echoes and canons with different instruments. And then in the chamber version, Hidden Light, I took this melody, horn melody, and put it at the very beginning. So basically, the whole piece shifts from something clear to basically to a disappearance of this clarity until it just basically fades away.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The sort of narrative element is different. You meant, I mean, the title "Hidden Light" has a sort of it seems to be pointing at something. I don't know. It has a
Ora Ganuz in Hebrew is a book of Martin Buber.
Oh, right.
It's a collection of tales of Hasidic, and I later discovered was really interesting for me.
Martin Buber was translated into Hebrew.
Yes, to exactly the Hasidic.
Much later.
Yes, in Kabbalah, Jewish Kabbalah, is the hidden light was creating the Genesis, and then after the sin of Adam and Eve, it was basically God took it away, and then He serves it to the afterword for the tzaddikim, for the saints. So it's really like again a very vague allusions of idea of a light, of something clear, which basically starts at the beginning and then disappears and basically never comes back again.
Oh, I see. Okay, so the title actually belongs to the revision. So it's
yes,
the crystallization, the opposite. And I mean, does Buber figure a lot in your reading? I mean, are you very interested in Hasidic ideas generally, and or is it just came?
Well, I was
about?
actually I was actually kind of observant in my 20s for a few years. I kept religion. I not anymore, but I still, I have deep feelings for tradition. And I guess when we did this seminar, I rediscovered some deep Jewish elements in my music, even though it's not always on the surface. So it was interesting to.
I mean, certainly light. I mean, on the spectralists and light and the sort of the bell light, that's certainly a feature of your music. And let's just listen to that this horn melody. As the beginning actually of the piece, so we get a little bit of the fading out, and this if you just want to say before we start, the performance is actually in Budapest, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a wonderful concert we had. It was an evening they chose some Israeli contemporary pieces, and conductor is Gregory Vajda. And amazing ensemble I just discovered then and we keep in touch ever since, is UMZE Ensemble. They are ensemble in residence for the Budapest Music Center.
Okay, so here's the opening, and I think we can sort of hear the horn melody, or perhaps brass as well. Yeah, and there's more of that on your website. I mean, it's a remarkable. There's sort of I know in that particular snippet we didn't see so much, but I mean, you enjoy using extended techniques and the like. Is that? I mean, and obviously the textures, your fluidity there is like you're looking fragmentary gestures here and there, and you're creating an amazing sort of palette. I mean, is this some? I was interested sort of where your sort of influences or attraction to particular. I mean, you've mentioned the spectralist. Are there sort of other types of other particular composers or techniques that are exciting you? And amongst them, are there any Israelis particularly?
I think that in this piece, again, you have maybe the French elements of the spectralism, as you said, and also I would say complex chords and textures for more German, like atonal. You mentioned the post-Schönbergian way I even go earlier, and also maybe in a way the Kopetman heterophonic textures you have, especially at the beginning. You have this horn melody, and then many in the orchestra's version is more apparent. You have many winds basically follow it in a very free canon. Kopetman himself, he described heterophony as a step between unison playing together and a canon, like a strict imitation. And in the beginning, you have this exactly as is, and you have this, the other
Yeah.
instruments follow the whole melody.
Right.
And you
So
have
it's a
this idea
complete-
at the end, like also in different sections in the piece.
Yeah, there is this, obviously, that Kopitman had this sort of heterophony as a sort of technique. I mean, I'm wondering, where else we've sort of seen it, but you could hear the way that the very subtle sort of shift of timbre to the trumpet from the horn and everything. I was just wondering also about natural tunings and things and note bending. I mean, are you using sort of this? You're getting away from the sort of straight tuning.
Yes, I do actually, and I use a lot of quarter tones and slight bending of the pitch, especially nice with large orchestra, and it's not that complicated to create. I do the semi-improvisation techniques for the strings. I point out freely in the measure when they basically with the finger. I call it bend the sound, like electronically sound. Basically, they bend the sound very lightly with changing the dynamics, and also winds like the flutes. You can do it with the clarinet, the trombone.
Yeah, so there's a lot of very, very subtle, very beautiful, sort of getting away from the sort of straightforward. And I know that we're going to end with the sort of the mandolin piece, because there, of course, you do actually do some interesting things on the tuning. And also the technique of playing the mandolin, which you do something very unusual at the end of the piece. Again, it's a very amazingly rarefied type of fantastically detailed texture and orchestral colors. And what a difficult challenge to write a concerto for mandolin. I mean, people have done it. Vivaldi did it. I have actually personal experience of speaking with our composer in London, Julian Dawes, on this COZ, who wrote a mandolin concerto. And of course, there's a lot of interest in the mandolin as an instrument. Particularly, the mandolin seems to have a sort of an Israeliness to it. There's some sort of, is there a mandolin orchestra or something in Beersheba? I seem to remember there's sort of mandolin orchestras, or am I wrong about that? But
yes, there's a huge tradition. Maybe Yaki can say something for us. And huge tradition of mandolin soloists. Basically, they studied with the same teacher in Beersheba, in the city in the south, and the biggest names maybe is basically, and today performing in Yaki himself, performs in Israel and performs abroad. And it was actually, I would mention this piece as an example of, for me, is always extra important to work with specific musicians and soloists, which I know, and conductors, of course. And I basically experiment on the instrument with them. And with Yaki, we spend a lot of time like trying to find out different fragments and different techniques, and with like different chords of 4 notes and like crazy things that we did there. And at the end, the surprise is basically he plays with using a cello bow on the knee. Is like almost like a Mediterranean or instrument, and so mandolin totally transformed into a totally different instrument with using of quarter tones at the very end of the cadenza.
Right. Okay. Let's just listen to that extract. So it's the end. This is Jakob, or as you say, Yaki Reuven, playing the mandolin with the Raanana Symphonette Orchestra. And again, it's Omer, Meir, Wellber conducting. And I'm just picking it up actually from the cadenza at the end. I'm afraid we can't listen to the whole the whole piece. But well, I will skip a little bit. This is from the start, or the middle.
So at the end, the mandolin goes with the concertmeister, the first violin, improvisatory-like. They go until the highest pitch possible, and basically it kind of fades away.
Yeah, it's a remarkable and amazingly atmospheric piece, and yes, it goes beyond words. What I should say actually at the end of everybody is that actually Ayal's works are going to be released on there's a CD coming out of only his works. I'm not sure exactly the playlist, but I think it's due out next year, 2022. And some of the pieces we've been talking about there, so sort of looking forward to that. This Mandelin Concerto was 2015, and I believe you wrote a piece immediately about the year after for a slightly different instrument of similar family, the electric guitar, a double concerto for was it electric and acoustic guitar, and used a similar technique sort of in the cadenza of bowing the guitar as well. So all sorts of amazing extended techniques. What I wanted to just end with actually, which is perhaps maybe something that people might want to ask, and I want to actually throw the discussion out to the floor, and hope people will have sort of questions to ask, is this question of where we sort of might understand you coming from the point of view of your connection with sort of Israeli music, whether you see yourself as a composer who happens to be in Israel or an Israeli composer, whatever that means. And we know that there are lots of different interpretations of what it might mean. The book by Asaf Sheleg, which we discussed a few weeks ago, brings the idea of not talking about generations, but certain earlier music being sort of part of what might be called a nationalist agenda or a nationalist allegory, and concerned with territory, whereas the sort of more recent works of composers, maybe not even sort of your teachers, I mean, could be Betty Olivera or similar, are more concerned with the sort of a type of global, non-specific type of use of different influences, and maybe non-hierarchical as well, trying to get away from the sort of what might be called Eurocentric. Okay, that's one particular framework for looking at it. I mean, there are different. Every composer has influences, and you've been very open about. You know, we've managed to actually touch on a few of those now. But are you bothered by the idea of this topic? I mean, can you deal with the idea of, are you an Israeli composer? Is that a question that means anything to you?
It's always been asked every time, of course, and it's very...
I'm not asking it, I'm asking about the question. But yes.
Sure. I'm an Israeli composer, definitely. Whatever
okay, so
that means.
Okay. You got out of it. But what do you think it does mean?
It's a good question. I think that, I mean, if we mention Kopetman, so basically we had this Mediterranean generation of composers coming from East Europe, and all these, folk elements. And these days in Israel, I think it's a very individualistic way of composing. We have amazing composers, even younger than I am, composers working with, you mentioned Meir Ensemble. They have this program called Tedarim. Is an MA program in the school I teach, in the Jerusalem Academy of Music and Dance. And they basically have these all influences of some of sonoric music and different elements of quite contemporary. Many of us, we studied in Israel, then went abroad, either to the States, to Europe, to Canada. Some of us returned, and we brought all these influences. So I think it's a very interesting period for Israeli contemporary music, because we have really an amazing variety of musics, and you have this, in Israeli Chag HaMuzika, Israeli Music Days every year during the high holidays, and you hear totally a wide spectrum of individualistic writing. So it's I think it's still an involving kind of culture of music making.
Thanks so much. Well, it's been a great pleasure to speak with you, and I think we'd love everyone to hear more music. It's all on, lots of it's on your website, and hopefully it'll be out in CD. So I'm going to stop here and hand over to. Is there an audience?
Yeah, certainly an audience. I'll field some questions. Just before we start, I'm going to grab a quick question, if that's okay, Ayal. I think it's amazing music to listen to. I'm interested in the relationship between texture and structure in your music. Obviously, there is some incredible textural work going on, and Malcolm mentioned the kind of collision of these very delicate elements and beautiful piano sonorities and extended technique and things. I wonder, when you're creating these larger works, how you're thinking structurally. Are you thinking structurally, or are you kind of thinking texturally, or is there another force at work as well?
It's really interesting question, because for me, the way I deal with texture in some works is in one interview I said sometimes I feel it's like walking and getting lost in the forest. I have this picture here in the forest, but so in some works I intentionally don't, like many other composers, I don't design the large scale form and then I kind of fill it in, but I start with a very strong idea, either a chord. Many works actually start with a cluster, with a huge cluster, and with the color, and then slowly basically it evolves, and at some point, and then I stop, I see what happens, and then I organize it, and then I allow myself to develop the form consciously as I go along. So basically I let the material dictates the continuation, but I always very conscious about the symmetrical and the proportions, but also the same time, the same breath, I would say, trying to be spontaneous and using the subconscious about that.
That's lovely. So there's a kind of organic relationship between the texture and the structure. I think for the little snippets we heard there, that comes across very, very clearly and very, very powerfully. It's nice to hear the explanation there. Thank you. Alex, you have a hand up. Alex.
Thank you. I found it very fascinating and very, very refreshing to have someone who puts their deveikus, which I call it, or deveikut, into their music and layer it, and it builds and builds and builds. So you mentioned earlier about a religious upbringing or a religious phase, and then a not so religious phase, but a neshama's a neshama, and whatever comes in comes out some way. So within your development and your different ages, teenage age, then on to the 20s and a little bit older, do you find that your development changes or change in different directions according to your belief, or the background was yearning to come out and it was still apparent in your composition? Or did you use different texts and different methods from your writing, your musical writings, with either the poems or where the background and where the tradition came from, or the text came from, in order for you to develop?
It's interesting. I mean, I originally grew up in a secular family in Jerusalem. I became religious in my 20s when studying in the academy for 6 years. And I wrote actually quite a lot of music during these years, some of them influenced by religious content. I wrote like a song cycle based on the Evan Gvirol and Yehuda Levi for choir, and very modal, very Bartokian, and also influenced by Israeli music, Kobetman and Ben Chaim, and American tradition, minimalism. And then well, I became secular again, but still involved, like interested in tradition when I was in Montreal. I mean, I had a Jewish teacher, and I was also in a Chabad many times. So I had these Jewish surroundings, but at the same time, the music really went to a very distinct French spectral elements, because the city is quite interesting. Is really in North America. They speak, it's bilingual. They speak English and French. The school is more like American, but it's all international. But you have many ensembles, and you have these colors and textures. So when I came back to Israel, I brought this with me, and I always say that to be an Israeli composer, because the intensity of daily life is so powerful, and always it's not, you can't just write textures, simple textures, and it's like it's different. And when I compare my Montreal period to my Israeli period, I find it's quite different. It's more intense and more dramatic. But at the same time, I remain this texture. So it's, I would say, like maybe an interesting combination of that.
Well, Malcolm mentioned something which asked you a question about, are you an Israeli composer or are you an Israeli composing? And when you look at the melting pot of Israel with the various different immigrants that came in, the Ethiopians, the Eastern Europeans, the Western Europeans, South Africans, they all brought with them culture, which subconsciously you hear around you in the different areas. So those will obviously subconsciously cause an effect for you to compose or to take on board some of these cultures and sounds as you go around Israel, the north to the south, the Ethiopians to the Bedouin to the Western, as you say, the German influence, and then the French influence, and so on and so forth. So is that subconscious or is it conscious?
I think it both, in a way, like maybe the bird nest, that you basically pick things that, to your nest, and then you have this your surroundings, and it's everything is who you are. But I definitely feel myself an Israeli composer. My Israeli identity is quite strong, and it was a good perspective because I was away for 4 years, and recent years I was fortunate to travel a lot, and so also I was chairman of the Israeli Composers League, and I was managing to bring some ensembles here, and we do tours there. So basically, I say I'm involved in the scene, but at the same times, I guess the music is also corresponds with European tradition, and so I guess it goes both ways in a subconscious way.
I'm looking forward to your CD coming out.
Thank you very much.
Agnes, would you like to have a question?
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Great. I was late through no fault of my own, but apologies for that. I'm interested about the practicalities of composing for both guitar or both mandolin. That was going to be my question, but after I put up my hand, I noticed that Jacob Reuven put in the chat that he would be happy to talk about the cooperation between the composer and himself. So,
wonderful.
So it would be great if he could enlighten us. And just to add a secondary question, I was just wondering whether Ayal, you already knew whom you wrote for, and you knew that the guitar player and the mandolin player also played the violin or something like that, a board instrument, or did you just sort of ask them to learn how to bow? But I guess we will find out from your performer.
It will be amazing if Yaki could say a few words about this cooperation and about the ideas of the mandolin and how the piece evolved.
Well, he offered, so please, let's have him.
Hi. First, Ayal and everybody, I'm Excuse me for the no video is the connection between my video to my new phone that I don't know what's going on with the Zoom. But I will be happy to share a few thoughts about the creation process with Ayal. It was amazing to see how much time and how much meeting we can have between a performer, soloist, and a composer, because it's not the first time I have this cooperation and get a solo piece by Israeli or non-Israeli composer. And we had meetings in Ayal house in Israel and spoke hours philosophically about past works of him, about my perspective, about the instruments, and I never felt that Ayal already know what you want to write or there is something doomed for the piece. He was always researching and asking and trying with ability to analyze the assets of the instrument. So time by time, I saw that it's like a genius that collect the sounds of abilities, my ability as a performance, and by the time to time more become a pure analyzer of the new sound that you can create with mandolin. I was amazed because each time it was more and more of looking on a genius, analyze the new sounds that I even didn't know that exist on the mandolin. And I will want to say a few things about the Israeli issue, the Israeli composers. And I will be less polite than the other speakers today. Israel has a big change culturally in the last years, and music in this genre of classical, modern, 21st century composer, time to time try to do popular interaction with instruments like mandolin and guitar or other, and in the easy way, put the instrument in the orchestra. And few times I even asked myself, do I want to play it? And when you see the process and the way Ayal writing music and creating music, you see if we look on the first generation between Ben Chaim until, let's say, the 19th and 2000, this big generation of composer, and the second one is after 2000 or from the 19th. So Ayal is the most hope for me as example of what I want to hear when I listen to Israeli music. He never left the Western techniques. He have all this heritage from Kopitman that was going into this sonority ideas, and never had discount for himself. And he will never put anything in his music, from my opinion, that it's only for catching another provocative or popular moment from the audience. Everything is so deep, and the colors always are so unique that I hope we will have more examples, but now it's a rare bird around what's going on in Israeli music. And I want to thank you personally, Ayal, for this wonderful concerto, wonderful experience with you.
Thank you very much, Yaki. Appreciate it.
Can I just come in?
I just want to say, that I think again that it's a wonderful period to be in Israel as a composer, because it's so alive and changing. And I always say that we have wonderful forces in Israel, and it's always a challenge because we are close to Europe, but not close enough to Europe. So it's a bit isolated, and it's why Malcolm and Phil, I appreciate this opportunity to bring some ideas to this international forum, and I hope it will be more opportunities to more composers and more kind of colors from Israel to be presented in Europe. And the after COVID, when the travels is free again and that we can allow ourselves to travel more, because it's a wonderful music to be discovered in this country. I mean.
Can I just come back quickly, please?
Yes, please go ahead, Agnes.
Yeah. It's just that my question got lost in the meantime. The practicalities of composing for a bowed mandolin or a bowed guitar. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? So the players for whom you write, do they already play the violin or the viola or the gamba? Or do you request them to be adventurous and get a bow and figure it out? So I would be very interested in that process, which way it goes.
Great, Malcolm. I don't know if we have a time to listen, maybe 1 or 2 minutes from the cadenza of the guitar concerto, because it's similar but very different. I wrote it a year later with, again, a very good friend of mine, Nadav Lev, who is New York based. Now he actually returned to Israel. He played both classical and electric. And again, I traveled to New York a year before. We had a commission from the Jerusalem Symphony for this guitar concerto. It was quite an experiment, because the piece is maybe the craziest and the most modern I wrote. It's quite a mixture between, I would say, advanced rock even, and like fragments taking from heavy metal, from rock, with these abstract colors and textures, French, German tradition that I work. And then he plays at the cadenza, he plays with the cello bow, but he does electronic loops. So I gave him parts of improvisation. We work together on it, and he basically builds it in, Phil, you asked about the layers. So
we've got the clip,
layers like piling up together. With he still play with the cello, then he left the bow, but it's still there ringing, and then he switches to different layers. So he basically piling up until the orchestra bursts to the final chords. That was a really interesting.
Ayal, I have the clip. We can watch it. But I just to get back to Agnes's actual question, is, you know, have they? I mean, you could ask Jakob. I mean, did he ever do that before? Did he ever bow a mandolin before? You know, are there other pieces that use this technique?
I think it was a first time for all of us. We took this idea and we basically improv and
experimented.
Yaki, and in Yaki and then Nadav, they learned amazingly fast, in a very short time, to play it like you play the cello.
I mean, it sort of reminds me that there's a sort of a precedent in my head of this oud trio by Michael Wellber, where he actually then changes to cello at some point. But I don't know if he doesn't actually bow the oud, but he just changes instrument, as far as I know. So it's this is going one step further. But anyway, let's just look at this. This is the cadenza from the double concerto, as you call it. Okay, I'll just share the screen. It's not very long. It's just a minute or two. So
Friedrich Shazlan conducts the Israeli Symphony, Nadav Levi solo.
Here it is. Yeah, well, applause from me. That the passion sort of it's the sort of thing I think Beethoven might have liked. You know, when he got. Well, I wonder what he got up to when he did his cadenzas. You know, before they were published. But I think you know what comes across there quite interestingly is that you build up this amazing climax, which you know, let's say another composer might sort of say, okay, that's the end. But then you have this wonderful afterthought, and everyone is absolutely transfixed on every tiny sound there. And this is sort of part of your, I think, wonderful gift, that you really make us listen in such depth and sort of discriminating different types of sound. And it's a sort of a real gift to make people listen. And I think that's your work seem to do that, whether they're for sort of solo piano or ensemble or electric guitar. That's a real, you know, a gift. And I think I sort of echo Jakob's comments. You know, it's sort of it's a very rare thing at the moment, and I think we're really sort of very, very privileged to have you here and to talk to us, and also that we can, you know, get to know your music. And I'd love to know what your plans are. I just actually wanted to end. Can I claim a sort of last comment? I don't know what we're doing on time. Oh, we should stop. But
fine. You just go for it.
The title of this was sort of the word resonance came in, and your work for Daniel Barenboim's orchestra was called Resonating Sounds. And I know you said that you actually might be expanding on that one. The piece was written in 2014. Is that work in progress? And also, I just wondered how Barenboim was. I mean, do you have any interaction with him at all when you're writing a piece for the orchestra? Is there some sort of dialogue there at all about the sort of compositions that they would like to play? Double question.
Yeah, definitely. I would say something again. You actually mentioned the guitar concerto is related again to what Phil said earlier. The form was, for me, when I reached this point, it was a challenge because the work is multi-textural. Is always something happening, and is a very restless piece, like 15 minutes. And then there's a huge, before we didn't listen, but it's a huge orchestral climax, and I didn't know what to do after that, because it's like it's over, but the music needed to go further. So basically I kept going, and then I reached the idea of another climax but bigger. So you have this climax, and then you have going down, and a tranquil, something soft and different starts, and then it goes basically going slowly upwards until it bursts with this idea of the bow. And then I came across this idea of the loops to bring it in a higher way, and until again it just breaks off and basically slowly disappears. So it's an example of how the form kind of rebuilt as the piece goes along. Yes, I would say working with Barenboim, and also I would mention again, or working with a close friend of mine, Omer, Meir, Wellber, is two huge conductors which I admire, and working with both of them was actually a process of interacting. Of course, with Omer more closely, because we kind of keep in touch close, friends forever. And with Barenboim, I knew him before. We had conversations about the piece for the orchestra, and it was an amazing process with the rehearsal, the way he basically worked on the piece. In the divan, it was starting in Buenos Aires, and then we went to the proms and Lucerne and Salzburg. And the piece basically sounds a bit different every time, every hall, because it's very resonance. And I was kind of the piece, even I would say, even kind of made it kind of crystallizes every performance. Same in the Munich performances, we had 3 performances, and we made even small changes with the orchestra, with the colors. Even with the Mandelin Concerto, as like always, for me, it's amazing that you have the written piece, but then you have the orchestra, and you want to change little things about dynamics, about tempi, about shadings, about octaves, and the orchestra is open and the conductor is fun to work with. You can experiment, and you basically you build the piece as you go along. So that was fantastic experiment. I met Barenboim just again before the COVID in Berlin. I was his guest. The Beethoven recital he did, and the Brahms evening he did with his orchestra, and we had some ideas, and I really hope to reconnect when the traveling is more free. And definitely this piece is a work in progress. I want to add 2 more movements for these resonating sounds, definitely.
All right, something to look forward to.
Wonderful. Has anyone got any more questions or comments? If not, then that seems like a perfect spot to wrap up. I can't see any hands or anything. Great. Okay. Well, in that case, I'm going to wrap up just to say thank you very much indeed to Ayal and Malcolm for a fascinating chat. I suspect for a number of us, this has been a new discovery of your music. So thank you very much for that. And we are armed to go out and discover more. Next week we have David Pressler talking about Chassanut, so we're going somewhere else again. But in the meantime, thanks once again.